Hello and welcome to the second PowerPoint of the week. This PowerPoint is going to be separated into two sections, the first being Japan post-World War II, and the second being Europe post-World War II. The European side will talk a little bit more about getting kind of into the Cold War, which we're going to start talking about next week, whereas the Japanese section will be a little bit more cultural, a little bit more the effects of the bombs themselves. So, without further ado, let's get underway. First off, I would like to open up with the question, do you support the use of nuclear weapons against our nation's enemies? Why or why not? Do you think that it is a valid method or a valid tool to use nuclear weapons? I'd like you to think about why or why not that might be. Now, a little bit of background on the actual atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Anyone within 1 mile of the blast was killed immediately. That is the force of the bombs. Then you would have, after the initial blast, you would also have, once things kind of settled, you would have what's called black rain. And black rain is when the fallout, the kind of radioactive debris and isotopes coming from the bomb mixed with debris, basically dust mixed with the kind of particles of things, and mixed with rain to create this black radioactive rain that rained on people after the bombs dropped. So even after the bomb dropped, people were not free to go back and do what they wanted. You also have what are called nuclear shadows being burned into surrounding surfaces to remind people about what happened. To show you guys a couple pictures of these nuclear shadows, you will see sometimes pictures. You will see pictures of these, and you'll see people saying that this is all that remains of the people that were there. Generally, that's not true. Generally, what this is that the heat or the radiation was obstructed. So there's a gentleman standing here with a ladder, and his body and the ladder obstructed the radiation and the heat from actually getting totally to this wall, which is why his shadow is still there. But that's how intense the heat and radiation were on these bombs that they left these kind of shadows. This is one sitting on the steps of, I believe it's a courthouse, basically on their break. This is their shadow. This is what marks where they were when the bombs dropped. Similar like this, you can see an older man or woman, and the way you can tell this, an older man or woman, is because of not only the posture, but also this right here, which is pretty evidently a cane that was being used to help them walk. Now, the nuclear shadows, the black rain, the fallout, everything that happened after the bombs was not necessarily foreseen by the United States when they dropped the bombs, but it did happen. And you have people who were affected by the dropping of the nuclear bombs, specifically those people living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs were dropped, were called hibakusha, which meant those who received the bomb, literally those who the bomb fell on. And these individuals suffered increased risk of cancer, increased risk of deformities, especially in their children. If they were women who were pregnant, they suffered increased radiation poisoning. You also have in Nagasaki and Hiroshima mutated plants, plants that are growing to 10 times their average size because of the radiation, creating this expansive growth. You also have people coming out of this with radiation burns, people coming out with severe radiation burns, and not just adults, but also children. You have radiation sickness. You have literally the radiation eating away at people's bodies, as you can see with this gentleman right here. You can see people's, the power of these bombs was so intense that it would potentially, if you were close enough to the bomb, vaporize your body until all that was left was your skeletal structure. This is a piece of art basically depicting the people who received the bomb. It is not a very positive image. They look almost like zombies or ghouls. And this is kind of to an extent how people were treated after the bombs because they were sick. They were suffering from radiation poisoning and radiation disease and radiation burns. And a lot of individuals weren't experienced with these things, and so they were seen as being diseased, as being outsiders. and this pervaded in Japan for quite a while. Now, after the nuclear bombs, you have an economic collapse in Japan, especially following the war, and you have a rebuilding, restructuring of the country, which heavily includes the United States. For example, after the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States continued to test nuclear weapons around Japan because it was occupied by U.S. forces. After the war, U.S. forces moved in, and the most really prevalent of these U.S. test sites was Bikini Atoll. But after the United States showed the world capabilities of nuclear weapons, other countries wanted to also develop these weapons, especially the Soviet Union. And the Soviet tests began to poison wells and water supplies. This was not good for anybody. The nuclear fallout poisoned water, it poisoned the air, it poisoned the landscape, it really poisoned parts of Japan, and it poisoned these islands which were being tested with nuclear weapons. After World War II, the Japanese army was dismantled. Officers were banned from holding office, meaning that anyone who was an officer of the Japanese army or military couldn't be a political official afterwards. You have the breakup of large businesses, also known as zaibatsu, to help create a free capitalist economy, and you have reforms made to land control. People were more able to get land, less people were holding land. In 1947, you have a new constitution being written, which lessens the power of the emperor and strengthens parliament. It also means that Japan can't declare war. In 1950, the Korean War brings Japanese economy up as a supplier of weapons. The U.S. and the Korean Peninsula buy weapons from Japan, bringing up their economy. And in 1951, the Supreme Command of Allied Powers, otherwise known as SCAP, allowed to keep bases, and the SCAP was basically the United States. They were keeping military bases, but they left Japan for the most part in 1952. With the presence of the Allies, specifically the United States, in Japan, you get a lot of pictures, a lot of art, a lot of different interesting little things showing soldiers in Japan, kind of mixing cultures, things like this. You get pictures of soldiers reading to Japanese children. You get relationships between American soldiers, Japanese women, who were enemies, but became, closer after the war. U.S. and Japanese relations strengthened after the war because of this presence of the U.S. coming in and saying, hey, we realize we messed up, let us help you. Now, to move on to something a little bit more cultural, you have one of the most famous monsters in history, in movie history, I should say, Godzilla, or Gojira, which came out in 1954, which is the Japanese kind of propaganda film based on nuclear weapons, based on nuclear war. It is based on the contamination of a fishing ship called the Lucky Dragon 5, and is a very anti-nuke movie. It is very propaganda-based if you watch it. It's not just a giant lizard destroying Japan. Now, this kind of emphasis on nuclear weapons, not only is Godzilla a lizard that gets radiated and becomes a giant monster, but even the movements that Godzilla makes are based on that of dazed burn victims, of people not knowing necessarily where they're going, of people kind of stumbling. You go so far in the Japanese film to create basically something larger than a nuke, something called the oxygen destroyer, which is the thing that can take out Godzilla, but it's seen as this hyper deadly, hyper evolved weapon, and it's kind of a talk about how you're going to have people say, well, we have to one-up this weapon, and we have to one-up that weapon, until eventually it gets something so disastrous that it could basically destroy the world. Now, obviously, an anti-nuclear movie coming from Japan is not going to look so great for America and American citizens. Also, generally, even today, American citizens don't really want to read subtitles that much in movies. So in 1956, 2 years after Gojira, you have an American film, Godzilla, which is basically Gojira, but they throw in an American reporter who basically says what's going on and basically makes everything a little bit better for the American kind of audience and American propaganda. This is one of the original designs for Godzilla, which you can see basically from certain angles looks like a mushroom cloud. Again, harkening back to the dangers of nuclear war. Now something a little bit probably familiar to you guys. You guys might have read this book in middle school, Sadako and the 1,000 Cranes. Sadako was 2 years old when the bombs were dropped, and she actually lived in Hiroshima with her family. This is a story of how 10 years later, when she was 12, she developed swellings and purple marks, which, when her family took her to the doctor, was described as radiation disease, which we know now was actually leukemia, which was caused, or her chances of having leukemia were increased with the radiation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Leukemia was very common in children after the bombs dropped, and the story of Sadako was that in some Japanese folklore, if you were to fold 1,000 paper cranes, you would be granted a wish. And so this story is about her folding paper cranes. In the book, she folds 1,000. In real life, she folded 1,400 and made the wish to survive. But she did die at 12 years old. But her story went on to create what's called the Peace Crane Project, which is a project that kind of shares her story and this idea of hope, of kind of overcoming diseases, especially in younger children. Just a very interesting thing. And there are memorials of her kind of all around. I believe there's one in Seattle, which was recently actually vandalized. But shifting to nuclear war. In January 1946, the UN called for an end of atomic weapons. So the United Nations said atomic weapons were used against Japan. The destruction of these weapons was so extreme, we need to get rid of them. In August of 1949, 3 years later, the Soviets successfully tested an atomic weapon. 3 years after that, the UK, the United Kingdom, has nuclear capability, and every couple of years following, another country developed nuclear capability and atomic weapons. In November of 1952, after hearing that the Soviets had access to atomic weapons, A-bombs, the United States tested a new, more devastating bomb called an H-bomb, or hydrogen bomb. In 1955, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto says end use of atomic weapons, and that is Albert Einstein, worker on the Manhattan Project, telling the president, you need to end the use of atomic weapons. Nothing is going to come of it that is good. In 1958, you get the UK disarmament campaign, which we get this symbol. The symbol is more commonly referred to as a peace sign, but what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that it's actually a symbol for ND, for nuclear disarmament, in semaphore. British semaphore, basically in holding flags. This is, I believe, a D, this is an N, and you have nuclear disarmament. In 2017, you get a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and today there's expected to be around 14.5 thousand nuclear weapons split between the US, the UK, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. But as far as we know, North Korea is simply testing nuclear weapons. At the height of the Cold War, there are a lot more than 14.5 thousand, and we'll get more into that when we talk about the arms race. All right, we're going to shift pretty quick, talking about Europe after World War II. A couple things just to look for are the Eastern Bloc, which is Eastern European communist countries held together by the Soviet Union, the European Coal and Steel Committee, which was a cooperation of countries to manage production of coal and steel, the phrase the Third World, which were developing nations not allied with either the US or USSR, the Iron Curtain, which was a physical, military, and ideological divide between West and East Europe, and the Berlin Airlift, which was food supply drops to Berliners during the Berlin blockade, which we will talk about. European recovery depended on three major factors, the first of which was the industrial society. Despite the massive amounts of destruction that Europe took, you still have the skills that are there. The people working still know what they're going to do, and this allowed for economies to repair themselves a little bit faster. You also have European countries deciding that, hey, maybe we should help each other out. Maybe we should aid one another. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. And third, and finally, you have the United States of America, which was untouched by the war and the new central power of the Western world. And being untouched by the war and a central power, the U.S. decided to help out Europe. It did so in two major ways, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine in 1947 said the U.S. would help any country under threat of communist takeover. Basically, we were so worried that the Soviet Union was growing that just in case they were trying something, we were going to help out. And those countries included China, Korea, which split into North and South in 1945 at the 38th parallel, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on, Vietnam, and Cuba. These three we're going to talk a little bit more about. Well, actually all four, but these three we'll talk pretty extensively about. China we'll spend about a day on. And the second way is the Marshall Plan, also in 1947, which said the U.S. will give financial aid to any European country affected by the war. This was a message of goodwill. It was a message of fending off another depression after the war, and it was also a way to basically flex on communism, saying that capitalism is so strong and has so much money that we can help provide for other European countries, whereas communists, you guys are only having to look out for yourself. Now, Stalin, kind of seeing that this was a move to show strength, refused aid. In the Eastern Bloc, all the countries that were kind of under the Soviet Union suffered from this, from not being able to take part in the Marshall Plan, not being able to take some of the U.S. money, and only Western Europe profited. This is the Marshall Plan's kind of insignia, and you could say, for European recovery, and very large as has supplied by the United States of America. The U.S. wanted everybody to know that it was the USA helping, to show that the Soviet Union was not doing what the USA was, to show strength. Now, the Marshall Plan required the cooperation of countries. It led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which in a couple of years would turn into the European Economic Community, and by 1994 would become the European Union, which we still have in effect today. All of these things reduced trade taxes. It made it so that countries could trade within one another a little bit easier. They had common trade policies and a common currency, which made trade a lot easier. You also have the decolonization of Africa and Asia, specifically the Philippines, the Congo, and India. For example, you had in Africa, before decolonization, you had 4 independent countries, only 4. After this decolonization movement, you had 46 independent countries. And out of this decolonization, you get what's called the birth of the Third World, which is basically First World is siding with the US and is developed, the Second World is siding with the Soviet Union and is developed, and the Third World is developing and not sided with either because they have other issues. Now the terms First, Second, and Third World have taken on a different meaning over the years, but that's really where those names come from. And also in 1948, you have the creation of Israel, which has been a matter of much dispute ever since. Just to show you guys kind of a map, you can see just the entire breakup of everything happening in Africa. And again, talking about imperialism, this is all because of Europeans, and it took about 150 years to go, hey, maybe we shouldn't take over a country and subject them to what we think is right. The Iron Curtain. Germany was split between capitalist and communist West and East. The eastern side was solidly communist. On March 5th of 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended on Europe. And the Iron Curtain is basically the physical with Berlin Wall and ideological or political separation of capitalism and communism. In 1947, you get what's called Cominform, or the Communist Information Bureau, which is responsible for the Eastern Bloc and making sure that everyone's on the same page, that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be from the headquarters in Moscow. In 1948, the Western German zones, the UK, the French, and the US German zones, all merged into what's called West Germany. In June, you have the Berlin Blockade, which is when the Soviet Union cut off all ways into West Berlin. There was no supplies coming from West Berlin into East Berlin, and as a result, you have these allied nations in West Germany sending over goods and supplies by plane and dropping them off, which is called the Berlin Airlift. It was literally this idea of, well, if you're not going to let supplies go in by road, we're just going to fly over and drop things. By May of 1949, the Berlin blockade had ended because people started realizing in government that this was not a way to win people's hearts. NATO. NATO is extremely important. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded in 1949 with 12 member countries. You don't really need to know who they are, but if you're interested, you can take a look over here. The US and the nuclear arsenal would defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union. Basically, the United States was the backbone of NATO with the nuclear arsenal, making sure that the Soviet Union was not going to try and invade other countries in Western Europe. NATO is still in effect with 29 member countries. Funnily enough, Russia is still not one of those countries. They are a political and military power, and the creation of NATO would lead eventually to a Soviet response called the Warsaw Pact in 1945, which was basically just a Soviet version of NATO. But we'll get more into that too. And that's really all I have for you guys for the reconstruction of Japan and Europe.